To me, a responsible business is a business that is authentic and that takes its values seriously.
My guest is a distinguished professor at the Copenhagen School of Business.
Is there really a need for what the company is doing, and do stakeholders also see this need to be served?
His research focuses on corporate sustainability and business ethics.
Get your values right, because at the very end of the day, it's a values question. It's about what we as an organization believe in.
My name is Alexander. I'm part of the People and Culture team at Greiner.
Greiner Talks. We talk transformation. Listen in and get inspired.
Welcome, Andreas Rasche.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Andreas, I am sitting in the heart of Vienna, and I assume that you are a bit further north. Where are you and how's your day?
Thank you very much. My day is really good. I'm based in Copenhagen at the Copenhagen Business School. And so far the day is going pretty good. Just a little bit of rain, but you know what? We are used to the rather mixed weather here in the north.
Did you already do some teaching today?
No, not today, but of course we do a lot of teaching actually at CBS, and we are also one of the few schools who really teaches the entire spectrum from bachelor, master, executive, PhD. So it is really interesting to see all these different types of students.
Research that matters and students that care, that's a tagline on your website. What kind of research matters to you?
Well, to me, it is really research that relates to practice, I would say. Whenever I define a research problem, I ask myself, what is the practical need for it? So I do quite a bit of research, of course, directly on sustainability problems. For instance, on sustainability regulations. This can be voluntary regulations, but also mandatory regulations. I've also done research on paradoxes and sustainability, which I found and still do find enormously interesting because it deals with trade-offs that exist and that we have to deal with. So I usually choose my problems also after having talked to practitioners and having had exchanges with practitioners to kind of see, what is on their mind.
We are already diving into the topic. You are teaching, you're researching around corporate sustainability, around strategic management, also in the light of global challenges. You've written books, you're communicating a lot, and you're very actively pointing out the need for transformation. So I'd like to start by asking a basic question. What actually constitutes a sustainable, or let's say a responsible business from your perspective?
I think it's a very good question, and probably a question we ask way too little. To me, a responsible business is a business that is authentic and that takes its values seriously. I think responsibility and sustainability have a lot to do with our values base, and that we really need to live these values in a corporation. So ultimately, for me, responsibility and sustainability have a lot to do with a corporation that really lives its values in the best way possible.
Talking about values, also talking about purpose, that seems a highly relevant question in times of the climate crisis, of environmental crisis. I'm wondering what actually justifies the existence of a business? What businesses do we actually need as a society?
Well, we need those businesses that solve problems for us in society, that we have, that address needs that we have. And I don't think, there is a pre-given list for that. I don't think there is a pre-given list of problems that should be addressed and not addressed. So probably we can debate which kind of problems should be addressed. But I think companies get their purpose out of society at the end of the day. Is there really a need for what the company is doing, and do stakeholders also see this need to be served?
There's also this kind of exciting concept, or at least it's exciting to me, that is the social license to operate. What do you understand by this concept? Why is that important for businesses?
Yeah, I think it's tremendously important. And, in the very early days of my career, I came across this concept and I asked myself exactly the same question. And as I was digging deeper into the concept, I realized there is a big difference between legality, so something is legal, and legitimacy. Something is perceived as legitimate and accepted. So I think the social license to operate is a lot about legitimacy. Companies can be perfectly aligned with the legal framework and still not have much legitimacy in the eyes of the stakeholder. And this is what the social license to operate is all about. It's about really securing your stakeholder approval, so to say, the acceptance of stakeholders, and not just focusing on the legal compliance mode, so to say, which is quite often the focus of corporations, of course.
When talking about corporate sustainability and all the sustainability claims that nearly all companies put out these days, I'm wondering, almost any human action, any human activity actually comes with a footprint. Isn't it an illusion that we are ever achieving true sustainability?
I think that depends a lot on how you define sustainability. And you know what? I have usually long discussions about this with my students, because obviously there are differences in terms of how people see sustainability. If you take a really strong definition of sustainability, then we talk about closed loop systems. So what you put in, you should also put out, right? So in a sense, you shouldn't create any waste and should be 100% sustainable. This, however, we know is a nice ideal, and we would all like it to happen, but realistically speaking, this is not how it works. And that's why most people go by notions of so-called weak sustainability, which allow for at least some waste to appear. Or, for instance, if you put it into the climate context, there are some emissions which you can simply not avoid, these so-called hard-to-abate emissions. So in these contexts, I think we have to accept that probably it is never 100%, but maybe also that doesn't need to be the goal. If we want to address the problems of the world, if you, for instance, look into the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you know, these big goals that the UN set out as kind of targets for a society, I don't think we need 100% sustainability. But if we, for instance, end up with 70, 80%, just, you know, to put it on a benchmark, then I think we would seriously address all of these goals and we would be on a much better path towards sustainability.
So you're also keeping it practical there.
I need to keep it practical. And the reality test for me is always my students, my executive students also in the classroom, right? When we talk, and I do quite a bit of executive teaching, and we talk through concepts and we talk through possible solutions, then they say, yes, we see this, but, you know, think about it from our perspective. If I sit in a boardroom or if I'm part of the executive management team, we need to balance so many different priorities. So from this perspective, I think it is good to have a reality check every once in a while. This does not at all mean, by the way, that we shouldn't be aspirational. Of course, we should have ambitions, and ambitions are very important. But on the other hand, we also need to make sure that things are implementable, because if they are not, we have not won anything at the very end of the day.
Andreas, there is a lot of talk on ESG these days. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And we hear quite a lot about the E, the environmental aspects, also the S, the social matters, but there's less talk around the G, the governance part. What is actually behind the G?
It's a good question. You're right. I mean, the G was kind of the latest edition, so to say. And maybe let me give you a little bit of history where this comes from. It was actually added at a UN conference in 2004, where investors met to discuss the E and the S, the environmental and the social. But the investors said, if we look at companies, we also need to make sure that they are governed in a good way, that the board is functioning in a good way, that people are paid fairly, that companies really pay their taxes, that there is no corruption. All of this falls under governance. So the investors said, if we work with companies and if we want to improve their E and their S, we also need to improve their G, because the G enables action on the E and the S. So this is a little bit the history behind it. And ever since then, since 2004, this terminology of ESG has taken off. And the G, as I just said, mostly deals with corporate governance and what enables good corporate governance. So at the end of the day, I think it is important to see the G in the context of the environmental and the social part, because as the investors said, and I think they were right, without good governance, we cannot really tackle these environmental and social problems.
That perfectly leads to my next question, because I'm closely working here with the sustainability colleagues at Greiner. That's around 10 people in our group and division headquarters, guiding the sustainability journey of around 11,000 people in more than 30 countries. Do you think we still need a sustainability team like this inside organizations in, let's say, 20 years from now? Or will sustainability simply be part of everyone's job because it is so crucial?
That's another good question. And the short answer is yes. Yes, we will need sustainability units also in 20 years from now. And the reason for this is that, of course, the requirements for organizing for sustainability internally, they are changing. And what we are seeing right now, by the way, also here in Denmark and all over Europe, is that sustainability is really pushed more into the business units. It is decentralized, so to say. This, however, is mostly done for implementation reasons, and also partly because some of the regulatory frameworks that have emerged recently incentivize companies to do this decentralization, for instance, to collect the data, the right sustainability data. However, that still means the sustainability unit needs to be there, probably with a slightly different identity in the future. It will be less about reporting. It will be less about data, because in a lot of companies, sustainability reporting and sustainability data is moving towards finance, where also the financial reporting sits. So a lot of companies also here in Denmark, they say, well, we put sustainability reporting where the financial reporting is. So in that sense, we put it all into one unit. And then the sustainability unit has the strategic oversight of all the sustainability initiatives in the company. And you need this unit that holds everything together. And that's why I think it will also be there in 20 years.
You have also mentioned reporting before, and my sustainability colleagues and also myself, we are spending quite a lot of time on pulling off these sustainability reports and collecting the data and writing the texts and following all the regulations that are out there. That is a tremendous amount of work. Do you think that this is the right approach, or are we over-exaggerating and focusing too little on action?
Well, I think ideally, of course, reporting would, in the long run, also lead to more action, to more impact, right? I think at the moment where we are in the sustainability field, if you see it as a journey over time, I think it is needed that we really put sustainability reporting on a very, very professional level, which is on par with financial reporting, so that we really get good data. Let's face it, in the past, we didn't have that good sustainability data. I also know this whenever I talk to investors. The investors said, look, we have a lot of sustainability data, but the quality is not very good. So they were always complaining. And this is what these new regulations try to fix. Yes, I agree with you. It is bureaucratic. It is a lot of work. On the other hand, we are probably right now in a sort of transition phase. And once we are through this transition phase, once we build up the right systems to digitally tag, for instance, certain indicators and data within the company, and once we build up the reporting and assurance systems, then it will also be easier in the future to do the reporting. And hopefully then we will also be in a situation where reporting leads to true impact.
You have also mentioned regulation, and that's another issue or another point I would like to discuss with you, because many organizations, including Greiner, seem to be flooded with new regulations around sustainability. According to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, there have been 1,255 new ESG regulations introduced since 2011. That's a crazy number. Are we moving in the right direction, or are we getting too complex?
No, we are moving in the right direction. You also need to see the bottom line, because 20 years ago, we hardly had anything in terms of regulation when it came to corporate sustainability. So we started from a very, very low bottom line. I remember, again, a little bit of history. When I started to research sustainability, everything was voluntary, right? But the voluntary approach didn't deliver. Otherwise, we would have not the kind of problems that we have these days. So we need to level the playing field. And in order to level the playing field, to make things relevant for all corporations, we need mandatory regulations. I think what is coming out of Brussels under the umbrella of the so-called Green Deal, which is kind of the umbrella policy framework for all of these regulations here in Europe, I think the timing could probably be improved because a lot of these regulations come at a very short period of time after each other, leaving corporations hardly any time to adjust and reflect. So I think this potentially is a problem. But the regulations themselves, I think, are needed because the voluntary approach simply didn't deliver what we wanted it to deliver. So we need to build up the infrastructure to create impact at the end of the day.
Some industry leaders, especially in Europe, are arguing that this increasing complexity and all of these regulations cause a major competitive disadvantage for the European Union. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, I heard these arguments before, and I also had even talks with people about these arguments. I think, to be quite honest, they are over-exaggerated. Look at the regulations. If you look at the regulations, you see that they are not just applicable to European companies, but they are also applicable to non-European companies that operate in Europe. Precisely for the reason that you were just mentioning, to not create any competitive disadvantages between European and non-European companies. So I think this is one point we need to consider, that a lot of non-European companies are also affected by these European regulations if they operate on European markets. And the second point is other areas of the world, they also move towards more regulation in the sustainability field. A good example for this is the US, but also China. Even China, which a lot of people don't really have on their sheet when it comes to sustainability regulation. They have introduced much more regulation actually on sustainability related topics. The US has climate disclosure rules, which right now are paused and which will more likely after some legal battles then also be implemented. So I think a lot is happening also outside of Europe, and we shouldn't make the mistake here to kind of say we become utterly uncompetitive just because of these regulations. Maybe, as a side note, if these regulations make us uncompetitive, maybe then we weren't competitive in the first place.
Bringing it back to the here and now on corporate sustainability, what's the number one advice you would give any organization trying to become more sustainable, in a nutshell?
My number one advice would be get your values right. Because we can talk a long time about regulations, compliance, all these fancy frameworks that are out there. We can talk about building super good internal structures for sustainability and having fancy sustainability departments. But at the very end of the day, it's a values question. It's about what we, as an organization, what we believe in. And what we believe the purpose of this organization is, and whether we really stand up for this purpose and are willing to deliver. And if you have this kind of moral compass, I think then you are safe with regard to implementing sustainability. This moral compass allows you to navigate even through stormy waters when things become uncomfortable and when you face questions that are maybe difficult to answer. I recently collaborated with a company which had to introduce a living wage in its supply chain. It was a very difficult decision for the company because there was no business case around this situation. You simply pay your workers in the supply chain more. But at the end of the day, what helped this company enormously was that the values of the founder, who also was the manager, were incredibly clear. And these values gave guidance in these difficult times when this question had to be answered. And that's why I would say my number one advice would be get your values right and let the rest follow.
You are working in sustainability since more than 20 years. If you could change one fundamental thing in this area, what would that be?
That we don't believe too much in the business case for sustainability. We have this discussion always around sustainability needs to pay And, there is this win-win orthodoxy sometimes. And when I started over 20 years ago, first research was appearing on these kind of questions. And a lot of research showed in the end, yes, it actually can be a good financial thing also to address sustainability. But I would always say this shouldn't be the reason why we do sustainability. At the end of the day, as I just said, replying to your question just before, it is and should also be a values-driven exercise. And that's why I think we should challenge this orthodoxy that there always needs to be a business case for everything. It is good if a business case exists, and empirically speaking, we have these situations that sustainability really pays off financially in a lot of different contexts. But we also need to be able to live sustainability in those situations where it doesn't pay financially.
So again, getting your values right.
Exactly. And I don't think we're there yet, Alexander. I don't think we're there yet.
Andreas, there's so many things we could talk about, but we're slowly coming to the end of this conversation. However, before I let you go, I'd love to wrap it up with you.
Greiner Talks. Let's wrap it up. I get inspired by
my students.
We need to start
becoming serious about sustainability.
Let's talk about
the trade-offs that exist in sustainability and which many of us choose to neglect.
What I wish for:
a really sustainable future.
Your message to the world:
stay curious.
I like that a lot. Thanks for the positive and hopeful ending to our conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed it, Alexander.
And thank you everyone for listening. Have a great day and subscribe to Greiner Talks.
Visit greiner.com. Share your thoughts and let us know who you think should be our next guest. Greiner Talks. Subscribe now.